Hello again. I'm back. I was here a moment ago, but I was rudely interrupted and made to start all over again, and I am pissed. But this is a story about someone who was pretty darn pissed also, so you might enjoy it, especially if you've ever been pretty darn pissed. For years, I've been a fairly prominent cognitive therapist, and then I've developed this new team therapy. And when I tell stories, it's often of someone who had a miraculous and rapid transformation. And people have often said, "Oh, I see you doing that with very successful people, but you couldn't possibly get those results with people who really have very little going for them and people without a lot of education and a lot of resources." And today's story is about a guy named Benny, and it addresses that exact question and teaches us quite a bit on other levels too. But at my hospital in Philadelphia, I moved to a place at the time. It was called the Presbyterian Medical Center, or Presbyterian University of Pennsylvania Medical Center. It was 6 blocks from the University of Pennsylvania, and it was an inner city hospital. When I moved there, they had a new office building, and I needed more room, so that's why I went over there. And then the hospital president said, "We don't have a department of psychiatry here. Would you help us develop a department of psychiatry?" And I said, "Yes, I would. Uh, and you wouldn't have to pay me anything. I'd do it as part of my volunteer work. But you'd have to agree to create a radically new and different kind of department of psychiatry." And then I told him, there's been research on my book, Feeling Good, that when people read it, 50 to 65% of them recover in 4 weeks without treatment. And they recover from moderate to severe depression. And it occurred to me, wow, we could have groups. We could treat everyone in groups. And I bet we could outperform my book. And so he agreed to that, and we developed a large cognitive therapy program. It was pretty much free to the people in our neighborhood. It was an inner city neighborhood. There was gang warfare, drug dealing, and a lot of the people in our community couldn't read or write. A lot of them hadn't made it through the 5th grade. And we developed this group cognitive therapy program where they'd come every day, not an hour a week, but for 6-8 hours a day, and get intensive training in cognitive therapy. We simplified it a little bit, but it was pretty much pure cognitive therapy. And I can tell you those people were the most responsive and the most grateful and the most gratifying population I've ever worked with. And once we got the program going, I would go over from time to time and sit in on the groups to see how they're going, or maybe even lead one of the groups. And one day I was going to lead the early afternoon group, and we had a nurses station. It was kind of like an inpatient unit. That they'd come, they'd sleep there at night and get meals, but it was quite different from a psychiatric inpatient unit. And I was going to run the early afternoon group, and the nurses told me that I'd have about 15 or more patients in my group. But they said, "There's one guy there you've got to watch out for. His name is Benny, and he's a local tough guy, gang member. He's admitted for suicidal depression and heroin and cocaine addiction. He's a drug dealer, and the word is that he gets easily enraged and goes and beats people up, and there's rumors he may have even killed some people. And so he's going to be in your group, and he hasn't acted out yet, but don't do anything to provoke Benny." And so I said, "Okay, don't worry, I'll be careful with Benny." So I started the group, and we were seated in a circle, and all I had was like a whiteboard that I could write on. And they were all seated there. There were about 15 people in the group, except one person was standing behind the group, pacing back and forth like a caged lion. And he looked like he was from the Italian neighborhood, He was about 23 years old, muscle bound, covered with tattoos with, death and skulls and things like that. And he had his t-shirts, his cigarettes rolled up in his t-shirt. And he was just walking back and forth, glaring at me. I said, you must be Benny. And would you care to join us and sit in the circle? And he said, I'm not going to sit in your GD effing circle. And if you try to make me, it's going to be the last thing you do, Doc. And I said, well, Benny, we don't ever force patients to sit in the circle. And but you can either sit in the circle or pace about during the group. That's your choice. But if you choose to pace about, you have to pace about here in the room or out in the hall. He seemed kind of confused, and he wouldn't sit in the circle, and he kept kind of pacing back and forth, glaring at me. And then the next thing I did was to ask the patients to shout out. I wrote a workbook for them. You can actually buy it on Amazon if you're interested. It's called 10 Days to Self-Esteem. And they took their tests, mood tests, depression, anxiety, all of that stuff, several times during the day so we could track their progress throughout the day. And the beginning of each group, they would shout their scores out. So I went around and everyone shouted out their scores. And then I went to Benny and I said, Benny, what was your score, on the mood tests? And he says, I'm not going to tell you my scores on the effing GD mood tests. And it was kind of threatening the way he said it. And I thought, well, maybe he's just embarrassed to share his depression score. So I said, well, you don't have to say them out loud, but could I just come over and look in your workbook so I can see what your scores are? And he said, if you try to look in my workbook, it's going to be the last thing you ever do, Doc. And so I got frightened again. I said, well, Benny, we never look in a patient's workbook unless the patient asks us to. So you're safe there. But maybe you could at least tell me your score on the depression test, that one test. There's a lot of tests there, but just give me your score on that one, if you would mind telling me. He says, okay, so if you want to know the truth, I got an 87 on your GD effing depression test. And I was thinking, my gosh, that's the highest score in the class. And I was thinking to myself, and that test only goes from 0 to 45, and he's got an 87. His score is literally off the charts. So I was puzzled, but I let it go, and the group was continuing on, and I was trying to get the patients involved, and we were talking about self-esteem and how, self-esteem should be unconditional. You can't earn your self-esteem, and because a lot of people there in the group, they didn't have much by way of resources. As I say, a lot of them couldn't read or write, and a lot of them were economically in very impoverished situations. Some were homeless, but they got all excited about that, and they were talking about times that they felt, like they were worthless. And one was a homeless man, and he says, I don't have self-esteem because when I see someone walk past me on the street with a suit and tie, I tell myself, he has a family who loves him. He has a wife. He has a bed to sleep on at night. He makes money. And I'm just a homeless person. And I sleep on the sidewalks. And nobody knows who I am or where I am. Nobody cares about me. I didn't make it through the 5th grade. I've never had a job in my life. I'm just a worthless human being. And then he started crying, and all the rest started crying. And I was thinking, boy, this is going to be a great group. And then that they're really getting it. It's emotional. They're crying. That's the way I like to work, with a lot of emotion. And then Benny started shouting at me, and he says, Doc, I'm so sick and tired of hearing all this GD effing bullshit about self-esteem and how you've got to be such a nice boy to get along in society, and you have to do what society tells you to do. and you have to do this and that to have self-esteem. You've got to follow all the rules or you're just no good. And as far as I'm concerned, Doc, you can take your effing self-esteem and stick it up your effing ass. And he was pretty pissed off. I said, oh my God, what am I going to say now? And I said, oh, well, Benny, you're exactly right. That's the point that I've been trying to make too, that you can't earn your self-esteem. And by following the rules or any amount of success or money, it's not going to make you worthwhile. Self-esteem is a decision you make to love yourself. It's not something you have to earn. This is a Buddhist thing that I've been teaching the group, that there's no self, there's no self-esteem. And you seem to know this stuff already, Benny. Tell me, were you raised as a Buddhist? And he says, I'm no goddamn effing Buddhist. I'm in the goddamn mafia, if you want to know the truth. And so I said, well, Benny, mafia and Buddhism are pretty much the same thing. And you could practically be my assistant and help teach this group because I think you know all this stuff already, and it's amazing to me. And this kind of blew his mind, and he got all excited, and he rushed into the middle of the group where I had 2 chairs that for role play and for demonstration. He sat down in one of those chairs right in the middle of the group, and he says, okay, Doc, if you think you're so smart, let's see if you can help me. And I said, well, what's your negative thought? And he says, here's my negative thought. I'm a hopeless case and there's nothing you can do about it. How are you going to challenge that one, Doc? I've been through every drug abuse program in Philadelphia. I've been through most of them 2 or 3 or 4 times. I flunked out of every one of them every time. How are you going to help me with my thought? And I was racing through my list of thoughts saying, my gosh, how am I going to help this guy? And then I thought, well, motivation. This is a motivational issue here we've got to attack first. So I said, well, Benny, let's do a cost-benefit analysis. So I took a piece of paper. Well, I didn't take a piece of paper, but I've got one here. I drew a line down the middle on that chalkboard and put for 2 columns, and I labeled the left column advantages, ADV, and the right column disadvantages, DIS. And I said, Benny, sure, that thought that you're a hopeless case is incredibly distorted, and there's all kinds of ways I could help you crush that thought. But before we do that, we've got to find out if this thought is helping you in some way, because if it's a good thing, if it's helping you, it doesn't make any difference if it's true or if it's distorted. So we've got to look at that first. So, Benny, let's list some of the advantages of telling yourself, I'm a hopeless case. Then he snarled at me, he says, Doc, there ain't no advantages. And I'll tell you this, Doc, I'll be dead in 2 years. You can count on that. You can put that in your disadvantages column. So I wrote, dead in 2 years over in the disadvantages column. And I says, Benny, I think you're not getting it. But we'll help you. Actually, telling yourself that you're a hopeless case is one of the best things you can do. It's helping you in all kinds of ways. And maybe the group can help. Group, what advantages can you think of? And maybe you could take a piece of paper right now and write down, can you think of any advantages for Benny in telling himself he's a hopeless case? And then the group started coming up with all kinds of advantages, and then Benny started chiming in as well. And I've jotted a few of them down right here. And right at the top of the list is that Benny, if you tell yourself you're a hopeless case, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to work hard. Like everyone in the group here is working hard to change the way they think and feel. But if you're hopeless, you don't have to do any of that hard work. So it's easy for you. Life becomes easy if you say you're a hopeless case. So we wrote that in the advantages column. And then someone else shouted out, and he can get stoned whenever he wants. And I says, yeah, Benny, I've heard that you're a heroin and cocaine dealer and that you've got the best stuff in Philadelphia. And so as long as you tell yourself you're a hopeless case, you can get stoned as much as you want and as often as you want. And I said, I've never once had heroin or cocaine. It must be awesome. Is it, Benny? And he says, oh, yeah, it's fantastic to get high. So we added that to his advantages column. You can get stoned whenever you want. And then I said, and you know, another thing, if you tell yourself you're a hopeless case, um, you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. You're a rebel. You remind me kind of James Dean. I understand you have a motorcycle, and when you get pissed at someone, I've heard you can beat the shit out of them. And you know, Benny, I was a minister's son, and I've always had to be so goddamn nice to everybody all the time. And I always wanted to beat the shit out of somebody. And tell me, Benny, is it as much fun as it sounds? And Benny says, "Oh, it's great." So I can put I put on the advantage column the joys of violence, and also that he can be. I said, you can be a bad boy. You can do whatever you want, whenever you want. You don't have to follow any of the rules of society. We have to pay our taxes and follow all the laws. You don't have to do that. And can you think of any other advantages? And someone in the group says he's the big man in the neighborhood. Everyone's afraid of him. He's tremendously important. So we added that to the list. I says, yeah, Benny, even the nurses told me to be careful of you, that that you were very violent and dangerous and important guy. And I'm supposed to treat you with tremendous respect and not get you pissed off. And then someone else says, and he makes a lot of money, dealing drugs. So he put unlimited money. And then someone else says he doesn't have to pay his taxes. So I put no income taxes. And then I said another thing, Benny, is you're very powerful. You intimidate people. How many psychiatrists have you beaten so far? And he says, oh, at least 13 or 14. I flunked out of every treatment center. And I says, and what's the name of the psychiatrist you're going to defeat today? And he says, oh, Dr. David Burns, no doubt about it. And then I said, that's right. So I added powerful to the list. And then I said, can you think of any other advantages? And Benny said, well, I get laid all the time. So I said, okay, unlimited sex. Yes, bad boys, handsome bad boys get tremendous sex. So with his help and with the group, we must have come up with 12, 14, 15 benefits of calling himself I'm a hopeless case. What's going on here is I'm working paradoxically, because I'm not trying to convince Benny to change. In fact, I'm trying to convince him to stay the same. When I'm doing this exercise, I suddenly became Benny. And I could see that all these advantages are very real and very powerful. And I suddenly couldn't see any reason for him to change. At that moment, his identity became my identity. And so I said to him, Benny, I'm just going to ignore that disadvantages side, but look at all of the advantages of telling yourself you're a hopeless case. You can get high whenever you want. You've got tremendous prestige. You can beat the shit out of anybody anytime you want if you don't like what they're doing. If they dare to cross you, you get unlimited success, tremendous prestige, all the money you want. Life is easy, and on and on and on. And Benny, all these benefits are real. So Benny, I have to tell you, I'm a little confused right now. I can't see any reason at all for you to give up that change, that thought, or to change. Yeah, that thought might be distorted, but it's the key to everything good in your life. And at that moment, I could see no reason for him to change. And that's the key to something I call paradoxical agenda setting. And what happened then, he became silent for the first time. He quieted down. And he looked up to me and he says, Doc, you read me like a book. So we made our first real connection that was warm, that he wasn't trying to put me down all of a sudden. And then he says, Doc, could I tell a story to the group? It's something I've never talked about before in my life. And I says, sure, Benny, we'd love to hear anything you have to say. And he says, well, when I was little, the person I loved the most was my grandfather, because he was a lot like me. He was in the same line of business that I'm in. And like me, I think he was prone to severe episodes of depression. But I loved him because he was the only person who'd talk to me. But one day, Doc, I was talking to him. I was sitting on the floor and he was in his chair, and he was talking kind of negative and frightened me. Doc, do you think that's something that a grandfather should do? And I says, well, it doesn't sound like it, Benny, but tell us more. What was he talking about that was frightening you? And he said, well, he said he was having problems with the family. And by the family, I don't think he meant his family. I think he meant his drug dealing associates. And Doc, he had a sawed-off shotgun in his lap, and that scared me too. Should a grandfather be scaring a little boy with a shotgun, talking negative like that? I says, well, it doesn't sound that way, Benny. It sounds kind of awful for you. What happened? And he said, well, he said that he was a hopeless case and that there was no way out. That scared me when he said that. And he took that shotgun and he put the barrel in his mouth. And he reached down, he put his thumb on the trigger. He pulled the trigger, Doc, and he blew the back of his effing head off. And when he said that, he just started sobbing uncontrollably, and tears were rolling down his cheeks, and snot was coming out of his nose, and his body was shaking. And it was quite a different Benny from the tough guy that he'd been presenting to us in the group. And after a little while, he kind of pulled himself together. Everyone in the group was crying too. And then he says, Doc, I have a bit of a confession to make. And he said, do you remember when I threatened you when you wanted to look in my workbook to see my scores on the mood tests? I said, yeah, I remember that, Benny. I was afraid. I was afraid you were going to hurt me. And he says, well, do you know why I threatened you like that? I says, no, Benny, I have no idea. I just know I asked if I could look in your workbook, and you said if I tried to look, you'd kill me, essentially. And he says, well, Doc, the reason I said that was because I can't effing read or write. And I didn't want the people in this group to see that about me. And then he started sobbing again. It was a fantastic experience to form a connection with someone as severe and hostile as that. But the key to it was not trying to change him, because that was the kind of battle he would win every time. And every previous mental health professional had made the mistake of trying to help him. Instead, I kind of, you might say, looked at his subconscious mind or his real motives. I mean, sex is a powerful motivator to be a bad boy, and getting high is a powerful motivator, and making tons of money is a powerful motivator. And once I was seeing the world through his eyes, I became him, and then he no longer had to battle me. Now, I'm not so naive as to think of someone as severe as that can be helped in what was essentially 20 minutes in a therapy group. But at least it opened the door to form that human connection. And so that's the story of Benny. I'll never forget Benny. It was a mind-blowing experience, and I guess there's 3 points to my story, and you may be thinking of many of your own. But it's not true that the kind of techniques I've developed are just for brainy people or people with a lot of money. The people at our hospital were the most uh, rewarding uh, people I've ever worked with, and the easiest people I've ever worked with, and the most grateful people, because nobody was giving them much of anything, and the hospital created this for them. It was for the community. It wasn't some big money-making deal for the hospital, because nobody had any money. And secondly, that myself had to die for my patient to find life. I had to die for Benny because he wanted to kill me. And I had to surrender my superior role as a medical doctor, a fancy psychiatrist, and give all of that up and see the world through his eyes exactly as he saw it. And at that moment, suddenly the miracle of human connection occurred. And the final thing is something I see all the time, is that the outer that we have and the inner, the true self, if you want to look at it that way, are often or almost always radically different. And to let down your guard, to share your vulnerabilities, can be a path to an instant transformation, instant connection with other people. So anyway, that's my story about Benny. I'll never forget you, Benny. Post editing David here. What in the hell does that mean? Producer told me to say that. Well, it's because I got an idea after we edited the video. So I said, give me just a minute to make a couple extra comments to people. The For years I've shown that video, and it's one of my favorite videos of all, favorite stories of all. I just loved working with Benny. And the messages for mental health professionals, I've shown it to audiences, all around the United States and Canada of shrinks. And they love it and they learn a lot from it. But what's the message for you if you're not a shrink, for the general public? And it's really the same thing. And I just wanted to point it out. And it's not like exactly some brilliant or deep thing, but I can be a slow learner. And it took me a while to kind of pop into my head, what is the message? And the message for you is the same thing. Let's say you have a friend that you're at odds with and you're arguing about something, or with your partner, or a son or daughter who's a teenager and they're upset, or a parent who's being overly rigid from your point of view. And we're often trying to blame that person or change that person, or argue that we're right and they're wrong, or trying to get them to change their mind. And when you do that, you'll 9 times out of 10, they'll yes but you. They'll say, "Oh, I already tried that. That doesn't work." You get frustrated. You run into a barrier, and that's what every therapist had done with Benny. Was trying to help him, and he failed. Every therapist failed. But when I accepted him exactly as he was, and he sensed that, and he could sense that I liked him and was accepting him, the moment I stopped trying to change him and couldn't see any reason for him to change, at that instant, he was transformed. And he suddenly let his guard down and started crying and opened up. And it was just a fantastic thing. And that's the message I wanted to give you, because the same can happen with the people in your lives too. You don't have to be a mental health professional to do this. The world right now is at odds. Everybody's killing everybody and hating and blaming everybody. But the message is, sometimes if you go in the opposite direction and listen and care about someone and accept them exactly as they are, at that instant, the magic can happen for you too. So it's just something to keep in mind, and it might take a while to get it and to make sense to you, but I wanted to plant that little seed, because if it grows and gets green and big and strong in your brain, which is weird, you're going to have a tree growing out of your brain. That's weird, but it can bring real beauty and real closeness and love and connection into your life too. So that's about all I want to say. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time. Bye bye.